The old telephone in the hall, the heavy black one with the rotary dial, had a particular weight to it. For 50 years, its heft felt like connection, like permanence, a solid link to the world outside the walls of the house my Eleanor and I built. I never imagined that one day its weight would feel like a tombstone pressing down on my chest. It's strange, isn't it? How the most ordinary objects can become instruments of your ruin. How a simple sound, the faint, careless click of a line not quite disconnected, can unravel a man's entire world. I remember the sunlight slanting through the window that afternoon, catching dust motes dancing in the air, a perfect, peaceful illusion just moments before it was shattered. I can still feel the smooth, cool plastic of the receiver in my hand, the way my knuckles went white. It was just an ordinary Tuesday, or so I thought. Before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing more. The call was from my son Lucas's financial advisor, something about a portfolio review, and he took it in the kitchen. I was in my armchair in the living room pretending to read the newspaper, but mostly I was just listening to the familiar sounds of the house. The low hum of the refrigerator, the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock Eleanor's father had given us. These sounds were my life's quiet symphony, the background music to my grief since she'd passed. When Lucas and his wife Chloe moved in 6 months ago, they brought new sounds with them. The frantic tapping of keyboards, the endless chiming of their phones, the hushed urgent whispers that would stop the moment I entered a room. They said it was to take care of me, to make sure their old man wasn't lonely in this big, empty house. I was grateful, I truly was. But a part of me felt like a ghost in my own home, a relic they had to step around. Lucas finished his call with a cheerful, "All right, talk soon, bye now," and I heard the clatter of the receiver being placed back on its cradle. Or so I thought. A few minutes passed. I decided to call my sister, just to hear a friendly voice. I walked into the hall, the old floorboards groaning softly under my feet, a sound as familiar to me as my own breathing. I picked up the receiver, and instead of the dial tone, I heard a voice. It was Lucas. He must not have hung up properly. And he was talking to Chloe, his voice low and stripped of the careful patience he always used with me. It was a different voice, cold, pragmatic. "It's a done deal," he said, and I could hear the faint rustle of papers in the background. "The offer is solid, $3 million. We can close in 60 days. My heart seized. $3 million? For my house? This house wasn't for sale. It was Eleanor's sanctuary. It was my last piece of her. Chloe's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence on the line. "And what about him? We can't close with him still living here, Lucas. It'll complicate everything." There was a pause. The silence stretched, and in that tiny gap of time I felt the world tilt on its axis. I held my breath, listening to the static on the line, the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. Then came the words. The 7 words that cleaved my life into a before and an after. Lucas sighed, a sound of weary impatience, a sound I had never heard him direct at me but now understood was his truth. "He has to go to a nursing home," he said. "It's the only way." My fingers went numb. The heavy receiver suddenly felt weightless, as if it might float away. He wasn't talking about a stranger. He was talking about me, his father. He was talking about putting me away like a piece of old furniture that no longer fit the decor. It wasn't the plan itself that struck me like a physical blow. It was the sound of his voice. There was no sadness in it, no conflict. Just the flat, sterile tone of a man solving a logistical problem. The refrigerator in the kitchen kicked on with a low hum, and the sound was deafening, a monstrous drone filling the space where my family used to be. I didn't slam the phone down. I didn't storm into the kitchen and scream. My hand, moving with a will of its own, gently, silently, placed the receiver back into its cradle, cutting the connection. I stood there, invisible, in my own hallway. My mind was a blank, white noise where a lifetime of trust used to be. What would you have done if you heard your own child deciding your fate like you were already gone? I'd seen the signs, of course. The way Chloe would look at Eleanor's old china cabinet with a dismissive little frown. The way Lucas would talk about unlocking the equity in the property, as if this house were a spreadsheet and not a home soaked in 60 years of memories. They were always talking about a big trip, a huge venture in China, something that required a massive investment. I thought it was just a dream they were chasing. I never realized I was the only obstacle standing in their way, an inconvenience to be managed and then removed. I took a deep, shaky breath and forced my legs to move. I walked back into the living room, my body feeling like a stranger's. They were on the couch together, heads bent over Chloe's laptop, smiling about something. They looked up as I entered, their faces instantly arranging into expressions of mild, dutiful concern. "Everything okay, Dad?" Lucas asked, his voice full of that false warmth he'd perfected. I nodded, the movement feeling stiff, unnatural. "Just stretching my legs," I managed to say, my own voice sounding distant. I sat down in my armchair, the worn leather cool against my skin. It was the chair Eleanor had read to me in, the chair where I'd held my son for the first time. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing my son's face. My gaze drifted over the room, over every object Eleanor and I had chosen together, and landed on the coffee table. My eyes scanned the stack of magazines, and then I saw it. Tucked just beneath a copy of an Architectural Digest was a slick, glossy brochure. Its corner was peeking out, just enough for me to read the elegant gold leaf lettering. I didn't need to see the rest. The first two words were enough to stop the air in my lungs. Golden Vistas. They hadn't just been talking about it. They'd already been shopping for my cage. My Eleanor used to say that a house remembers everything. She believed the walls absorbed the laughter, the arguments, the whispered secrets, and held them forever. After the phone call, I started to feel it, a coldness seeping from the plaster, a quiet dread that had nothing to do with a winter draft. It was the memory of my son's voice, sterile and final, now embedded in the very foundation of our lives. How do you fight a ghost that wears your own child's face, a phantom that walks the halls of your home and methodically plans your erasure? I'd spent the night in my armchair, watching the moonlight shift across the floorboards, each beam illuminating another memory, another ghost. I saw Eleanor, her hands dusted with flour, humming in the kitchen. I saw a small boy with scraped knees, Lucas, running into my arms in the hallway. These weren't just memories anymore. They were evidence. Exhibits in a trial where I was the only one who knew a crime was being committed. The next morning, the illusion of a happy family was back in full force. Chloe made me my oatmeal, a sweet, gummy paste I couldn't stomach, and she watched me eat it with a look of practiced patience. Her eyes, however, weren't on me. They were on the things around me. She stared at the hand-carved mantelpiece, a wedding gift from my father with a clinical detachment, as if measuring it for a packing crate. Her gaze slid over Eleanor's collection of porcelain birds on the windowsill, and I saw a flicker of something in her expression. Not admiration, but calculation. She was liquidating my life in her head. Lucas avoided my eyes completely. He rustled his newspaper with too much force, the sound loud and brittle in the morning quiet. He was a bad liar. He always had been. As a boy, his tells were obvious, a twitch in his jaw, a refusal to stand still. Now he was a man, but the tells were still there, just buried under a thin layer of corporate polish. The twitch was still in his jaw. "We were thinking, Dad," Chloe began, her voice syrupy sweet, a tone she used when she wanted something. "This place is wonderful, but it could use a little freshening up. You know, for you, to make it brighter." I looked at her, my face a carefully constructed mask of benign confusion. "Brighter?" I asked, my voice a little frail on purpose. "It seems bright enough to me." Lucas finally put his paper down. "What Chloe means is maybe a professional eye could help. We've invited an interior designer to come by this afternoon just to give us some ideas. No cost to you, of course, our treat." An interior designer. The lie was so bald, so insulting in its simplicity, that a cold, hard knot of anger formed in my gut. They thought I was a fool, a doddering old man who wouldn't see past the pretty words. I looked from his face to hers, this united front of deceit. Do you think I was too forgiving here? Or was it just the calm before the storm? I gave them a slow, tired smile. Well, that sounds lovely, I said softly. A new perspective is always nice. I saw the relief wash over them, a shared, silent exhale. They had cleared another hurdle. The old man was compliant. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the living room when the doorbell chimed. It wasn't an interior designer who walked in. I knew it the moment I saw her. Her name was Ms. Albright, and she had the sharp, predatory eyes of a hawk and a smile that didn't reach them. She wasn't here to talk about paint swatches and throw pillows. She was here to assess the value of the kill. She walked through the rooms, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors like a death watch beetle. Lucas and Chloe flanked her, pointing out features with a salesman's forced enthusiasm. Original crown molding, Lucas would say. Solid oak flooring throughout, Chloe would add. Ms. Albright would just nod, her eyes scanning, absorbing, monetizing every inch of my life. I watched them from my armchair, a silent, invisible observer. I saw her run a finger along Eleanor's rosewood piano, not with appreciation, but to check for scratches. I saw her glance out at the garden, not at the blooming roses my wife had nurtured for decades, but at the size of the lot, her lips silently mouthing numbers. She was dissecting my home, stripping it down to its bones, its square footage, its market value. She wasn't seeing a home at all. She was seeing a product. And I, sitting in the corner, was just part of the inventory that needed to be cleared out. After her tour, they huddled in the kitchen, their voices low whispers I couldn't quite catch, but I didn't need to. I could see it in the triumphant gleam in Chloe's eyes when they returned. I could see it in the way Lucas stood a little taller, the weight of his betrayal momentarily forgotten in the thrill of a potential sale. Ms. Albright gave me a brief professional nod on her way out. "You have a lovely property," she said, the words feeling like a final verdict. After the door closed, a charged silence filled the house. Chloe was practically buzzing with excitement. She turned, her eyes sweeping across the living room, no longer with calculation but with the dismissive air of a new owner about to renovate. Her gaze landed on the wall of photographs above the fireplace. Our wedding, Lucas's christening, family vacations, a lifetime captured in silver frames. She let out a small, impatient sigh. "Well," she said, mostly to Lucas, but loud enough for me to hear every syllable. "All this old clutter will have to go, of course. No one wants a house that feels like a museum to someone else's life." And there it was. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't just about the house. It was about erasing us. Erasing Eleanor. My breath caught in my throat. My wife's memory wasn't a treasure to them. It was clutter. A problem to be disposed of along with the old furniture and the outdated wallpaper. I looked at the photograph of Eleanor, taken just a year before she passed. Her smile so full of life it felt like she could step right out of the frame. Her life wasn't clutter. It was the only thing holding these walls up. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The grief and the shock hardened into something else, something cold and sharp and resolute. They had made a fatal error. They thought they were dealing with a frail old man. They had no idea they were dealing with Eleanor's husband. Grief is a patient thief. It takes things from you slowly at first, your appetite, your sleep, your ability to imagine a future. Then it gets bolder. It starts stealing entire days, blurring them into a fog of quiet sorrow. But the cruelest thing it ever stole from me was my fight. Since Eleanor's passing, I had allowed myself to become a spectator in my own life, a passive recipient of my son's condescending care. But hearing Chloe dismiss my wife's memory as clutter, that woke something up. It was a cold, quiet rage, not a fiery explosion, but the deep, glacial anger of a man who has nothing left to lose. I knew then I couldn't just be angry. Anger was a fuel, but it wasn't a plan. What I needed was a weapon. And in a war of whispers and deception, the best weapon is the truth. The problem was, my truth was locked away, buried under years of dust and forgotten promises. I just had to find it. The next few days, I played my part beautifully. I was the docile, slightly confused father they wanted me to be. I ate the bland meals, nodded at their talk of downsizing for my comfort, and even let Chloe pack away some of Eleanor's porcelain birds into a cardboard box, each one a tiny stab to my heart. "Just to keep them safe from the dust, William," she'd said, her voice dripping with false concern. I watched her wrap each delicate figure in tissue paper, her movements efficient and unsentimental, and I felt a profound sense of regret. I had let them in. I had mistaken their ambition for affection, their pity for love. What would you have done if your own son was dismantling your life right in front of your eyes? They were so confident, so sure of their victory, that they grew careless. They left bank statements on the kitchen counter, documents from a holding company I'd never heard of, and flight itineraries for a 2-month business trip to Shanghai and Beijing. They were moving quickly, tying up loose ends, preparing to cash in their inheritance before I was even gone. They thought I was oblivious, lost in my memories. But I was watching. I was listening. I was gathering the pieces of their betrayal. My mission began in the one place they never went, the attic. It was Eleanor's domain, a dusty sanctuary of labeled boxes and forgotten treasures. Climbing the rickety pull-down stairs felt like ascending into the past. The air up there was thick with the scent of old paper and cedar, the smell of time itself. Moonlight filtered through a single grimy porthole window, illuminating towers of boxes that held our entire life together. I was looking for one box in particular. It was an old military footlocker from my time in the service, and Eleanor had used it to store the most important documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, old love letters, and I hoped the one thing that could stop them. I worked by the dim light of a flashlight, my hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from a potent mix of fear and adrenaline. My fingers, rough and calloused from a lifetime of working with my hands, brushed against the brittle edges of old photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings. Each touch was a memory. Finally, my light landed on it, tucked away behind a stack of my old engineering textbooks, the heavy green footlocker. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lifted the heavy lid. A wave of mothballs and memory washed over me. Inside, nestled among bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, was a thick manila envelope. My name was written on the front in Eleanor's elegant, looping script. With shaking hands, I pulled out the contents. It wasn't just the deed to the house, which I expected. It was something more. It was the original architectural blueprints, the survey maps, and a series of legal documents I hadn't looked at in over 50 years. My eyes scanned the dense legalistic text, my mind struggling to catch up. And then I saw it. A covenant. A restriction written into the original deed when we first bought the land from an old farmer who loved this patch of earth as much as we did. He made us promise we would never subdivide, never build anything but a single-family home, and that the property would be used for residential purposes only. It was a promise made on a handshake and then legally bound in ink. But that wasn't the important part. The important part was a secondary clause Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, had insisted upon. A clause I had completely forgotten. It stipulated that in the event of my incapacitation or death, full and sole ownership of the property would not pass directly to our heir. Instead, it would be transferred into a trust she had set up years ago to be managed by her younger brother, my brother-in-law, Richard. A man Lucas and Chloe had systematically alienated and pushed out of our lives, calling him a meddling old fool. The trust's directive was explicit. The house was not to be sold. It was to be preserved, and its beneficiary, me and then after me, any grandchildren, could live in it but never liquidate it. The property was meant to be a legacy, not a windfall. They couldn't sell the house, not legally, not without Richard's signature, And Richard, who loved his sister more than anything, would never, ever betray her wishes. A low, shaky laugh escaped my lips. It sounded foreign in the silent, dusty attic. They had built their entire plan on a foundation of sand. They were trying to sell a house that wasn't theirs to sell. I sat there on the floor of the attic, the documents spread out before me like a battle map. The moonlight illuminated the faded ink, the legal jargon a symphony of salvation. They had made their move, confident in my weakness. They had no idea I was holding a royal flush. They thought they were just waiting for me to be moved into a home. They had no idea they were about to be evicted. I must confess something. A father's love can be a powerful form of blindness. For years I saw Lucas not as the man he was becoming, but as the boy he used to be. The one who needed me to check for monsters under his bed. The one whose face would light up when I came home from work. I see now that I indulged him too much, shielded him from the consequences of his own choices, and mistook his ambition for strength of character. I loved the memory of my son so fiercely that I failed to see the stranger who was growing in his place. Was I a monster for what I was about to do to him? Or was I just a father pushed too far, finally opening his eyes? Coming down from the attic that night, the manila envelope felt heavier than a stack of bricks. It wasn't a symbol of victory. It was a death certificate for the relationship I thought I had with my son. I tucked it safely back into the footlocker and pushed it deep into the back of my closet, behind my old wool coats that still smelled faintly of Eleanor's perfume. The next morning, the house was filled with a new kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude. It was the tense, airless silence of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. I could hear the faint, frantic tapping of Chloe's fingernails on her phone. I could hear the rhythmic clink of the spoon as Lucas stirred his coffee, a nervous, repetitive sound that went on for far too long. They were ghosts, just as I was, haunting these rooms with their unspoken anxieties. They were so close to their prize, and the stress was making them fray at the edges. I saw it in the dark circles under Lucas's eyes, the way Chloe's smile was stretched a little too tight. This wasn't just greed, this was desperation. What had they gotten themselves into? That afternoon, while they were out on some mysterious errand, likely meeting with the real estate agent, I walked into the study and closed the door. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in almost a year. It rang 3 times, each ring echoing in the hollow space in my chest. Then a voice answered, gruff and familiar. "Hello?" "Richard," I said, my own voice sounding thin. "It's William." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then the gruffness softened. "William, it's good to hear you. Is everything all right? I've been worried." That one word, worried, was all it took. The carefully constructed dam inside me broke, and the story came tumbling out. The phone call, the designer, the brochures for Golden Vistas, the whispers. I told him everything. I didn't cry. My voice remained level, cold even, as I recounted the facts. When I finished, the silence on the line was heavy. I could hear his slow, steady breathing. Finally he spoke, his voice low and laced with a sorrowful anger. "That boy," he said, and I knew he meant Lucas. Eleanor saw it in him, you know. She worried he had a hole in his heart that he was always trying to fill with things. I told her she was being too hard on him. He sighed, a sound heavy with regret. Turns out a mother is never wrong. He was right. Eleanor had seen it. She had tried to warn me in her gentle way that Lucas's ambition was a hungry fire that could one day consume everything in its path, including us. I told Richard about the trust, about the clause he was meant to enforce. His voice hardened with resolve. "I remember," he said. "Eleanor made me swear an oath on her father's Bible. That house was her heart, William. She said it was the only thing we could be sure to pass down that mattered. I asked him if he would come, if he would stand with me. "I'll be on the first flight tomorrow morning," he said without a moment's hesitation. Then he added something that sent a chill down my spine. "And William, It's worse than you think. There are things about that China venture you don't know. Things I've heard. Be careful." Before I could ask what he meant, he hung up. I sat there in the study, the dead receiver in my hand, a new layer of dread settling over me. It wasn't just about the house anymore. Lucas was in some kind of trouble. A trouble so deep he was willing to sell his own father's future to escape it. The next day was the longest of my life. I moved through the hours in a fog, playing my role, while a storm gathered on the horizon. Lucas and Chloe were giddy, almost euphoric. They had returned from their errand with takeout from a fancy restaurant and a bottle of expensive champagne. "A little celebration," Chloe announced, avoiding my eyes as she popped the cork. "To new beginnings." They thought they were celebrating their impending freedom, their $3 million escape. They raised their glasses, their faces flushed with success. I raised my glass of water, my hand steady, my expression unreadable. I watched them toast to my destruction, and I felt nothing but a profound, icy calm. They were so absorbed in their victory lap they barely noticed the time. They laughed and scrolled through pictures on their phones, showing each other resorts in Bali and luxury apartments in Shanghai. They were already spending the money. They were already gone. And then, at precisely 4:15 p.m., the doorbell rang. The sound cut through their laughter like a shard of glass. Chloe looked annoyed. Lucas sighed, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "I'll get it," he said, pushing his chair back. "Probably just a delivery." I didn't move. I just sat at the dining room table watching him. I heard him walk down the hall. I heard the deadbolt slide back. I heard him open the front door. There was a moment of absolute silence. Then I heard my son's voice, tight with shock and disbelief. "Uncle Richard, what on earth are you doing here?" Secrets have a sound. Before they're spoken, they exist as a pressure in the room, a change in the air that makes your skin prickle. The moment Richard stepped across the threshold, the entire atmosphere in our house changed. The smug, celebratory mood curdled into something thick and suffocating. My brother-in-law was not a large man, but he carried with him the unshakable gravity of a person who lives by a strict, old-fashioned code of honor. He had Eleanor's eyes, clear, direct, and incapable of tolerating deceit. He didn't look at Lucas with anger, but with a deep, profound disappointment that was somehow far worse. Chloe froze in the dining room, the champagne flute halfway to her lips, her face a mask of confusion and suspicion. She knew, instinctively, that this was not a social call. This was an intrusion, an unexpected variable in her perfectly calculated equation. "Richard," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too bright. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you." Richard's gaze moved from Lucas to her, and the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. He didn't acknowledge her greeting. He simply walked past Lucas, his worn leather briefcase in his hand, and came to stand by the dining room table. He looked at me, and in that one look, a lifetime of shared history passed between us. Grief for his sister, a silent promise to protect what she had built. "Hello, William," he said, his voice calm and steady. Then he turned his attention back to his nephew. "Lucas, Chloe, I think it's time we all had a talk." Lucas finally found his voice. It was brittle, defensive. "A talk about what? This is a bad time, we're in the middle of something." "Yes," Richard said, his eyes sweeping over the champagne bottle and the celebratory takeout. "I can see that. You're celebrating." He placed his briefcase on the table with a soft, definitive thud. "Tell me, what exactly is the occasion?" The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Lucas and Chloe exchanged a panicked glance, a silent, frantic communication. They were trapped. To lie would be pointless. To tell the truth, impossible. I decided to release the pressure, just a little. "Richard was just in the area, Lucas," I said, my voice gentle. "He wanted to stop by and see how I was getting along." It was a lifeline, a chance for them to retreat, to recalibrate. but they were too arrogant, too far down their path of deception to take it. Chloe recovered first, her own training in corporate warfare kicking in. She plastered a smile on her face. Of course. Well, it's wonderful to see you. Can I get you a drink? Some champagne? No, thank you, Richard said, his gaze unwavering. I'm not here to celebrate. I'm here because I'm the trustee of my sister's estate, and it has come to my attention that certain parties have been attempting to illegally liquidate an asset of that trust. He unlatched his briefcase. The metallic click echoed in the silent room. Chloe's smile vanished. Lucas's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. He stammered, the words hollow. Richard pulled out a single, thick document, a copy of the trust agreement. He didn't slam it on the table. He placed it down gently, sliding it across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of Lucas. This house, Lucas, Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. This house is not yours to sell. It never was. It belongs to the trust Eleanor created to protect her husband, to protect your father, a trust of which I am the sole executor. Lucas stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. He wouldn't touch it. He just stared, his mind visibly racing, searching for an escape route, an angle, a loophole. But Eleanor and Richard had built a fortress. That's not possible, Chloe whispered, her bravado finally crumbling. Our lawyer checked the deed. Your lawyer checked the public deed, Richard corrected her coolly. He didn't check the private trust documents because you never told him they existed. You likely didn't even know. Eleanor was a smart woman. She foresaw the possibility that your ambition might one day outweigh your love for this family. The word ambition hung in the air, a polite substitute for the uglier word they all knew he meant: greed. Lucas finally looked up from the document, his eyes wild with desperation. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not a calculating stranger, but that terrified little boy from long ago. Dad, he pleaded, his voice cracking. You don't understand. I had to. I didn't have a choice. And then it all came out. The China venture wasn't just a dream. It was a disaster. He had invested heavily with partners who turned out to be criminals. The deal had collapsed, and he was left holding a mountain of debt not to a bank but to dangerous people. People who didn't file lawsuits. They made threats. Threats against him and against Chloe. The house was his only way out. Selling it wasn't for a life of luxury. It was to save his own skin. He had betrayed me not out of simple greed, but out of sheer, primal fear. I looked at my son, the man he had become, a cornered animal willing to sacrifice his own father to escape the consequences of his actions. The story was more sordid than I could have imagined. But the truth didn't change the facts. It didn't change the phone call I'd overheard. His fear didn't excuse his cruelty. Richard listened to the whole pathetic story without a word. When Lucas was finished, breathless and shaking, Richard simply shook his head slowly. Your problems are your own, Lucas, he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. You do not get to solve them by destroying your father's life and desecrating your mother's memory. He closed his briefcase. The sale is off. I've already spoken to Ms. Albright's agency and informed them of the legal situation. They have, needless to say, dropped you as clients. He then turned to me. William, you don't have to stay here another minute. You can come home with me. Tonight. It was then that Chloe finally broke. A choked, hysterical sound escaped her lips. No, she said, her voice trembling with rage. No, you can't. We've already spent it. We took out a bridge loan against the sale. The money. It's gone. A house that has heard a confession of that magnitude never feels the same again. The very air becomes heavy with the ghosts of bad decisions. The champagne bottle on the table, once a symbol of their triumph, now looked like a funeral vase. Chloe's admission that the money was already gone, spent, vanished into the ether of their desperation, hung in the room like a toxic cloud. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was a complete and utter ruin, a crater they had dug for me and promptly fallen into themselves. I looked at Lucas, my son, and saw the full, devastating weight of his failure crash down upon him. The bravado, the arrogance, the cool pragmatism I had heard on the phone, it all dissolved, leaving behind a hollowed-out man, finally face to face with a problem he couldn't lie his way out of. He sank into a dining chair, his head in his hands, a low, wretched sound coming from his throat. For a fleeting moment, a pang of fatherly instinct of pity went through me. But then I remembered the coldness in his voice when he sentenced me to a nursing home. I remembered Chloe calling my wife's life clutter. Pity is a luxury you cannot afford when you are fighting for your own survival. Richard, ever the stoic, simply nodded, as if Chloe's confession was exactly what he expected to hear. He picked up his briefcase. "That is a problem for your creditors," he said, his voice flat and final. "It is not a problem for this family or for this house. My sister's legacy is secure. That is all that matters." He turned to me, his expression softening. "William, let's go." I stood up, my legs feeling steadier than they had in months. I didn't look at Lucas or Chloe. I walked out of the dining room and towards the hall closet to get my coat. As I passed the old rotary phone on the hall table, I ran my hand over its cool black surface. The instrument of my heartbreak had become the instrument of my liberation. It had told me the truth, and the truth, as it turned out, had set me free. My son and his wife remained frozen at the table, two statues in a tableau of their own making. They didn't beg, they didn't apologize. They were in shock, paralyzed by the sheer speed and totality of their defeat. As Richard and I walked towards the front door, Lucas finally spoke, his voice muffled by his hands. "Where will we go?" It was a question directed at the universe, not at me. The question of a child who has always been bailed out, who has never had to face the true consequences of his actions. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, and for the first time I turned back to look at them. I saw two deeply broken people who had gambled with everything that mattered and lost. I felt a profound, aching sadness, not for them, but for the family we could have been. "I don't know, son," I said, and my voice was not angry, just weary. "You were so eager to put me in a home. I suppose now you'll have to find one of your own." And with that, I closed the door on them. I closed the door on my house, on 60 years of memories, and on the son I no longer knew. The weeks that followed were a blur. I stayed with Richard, in his quiet, orderly home. We talked for hours about Eleanor, about the old days, healing a wound that had been left to fester for too long. Lawyers were involved. The mess Lucas and Chloe had made was extensive, a tangled web of debt and deceit. They were forced to declare bankruptcy. The people they owed money to were not, as Richard had warned, the forgiving type. But that was their story now, not mine. The house sat empty. Richard, as trustee, had the locks changed. Legally, Lucas and Chloe had no right to be there. Their things were packed up and put into storage. I received a letter from them a month later, postmarked from a city I didn't recognize. It was a single page, filled with excuses, justifications, and a half-hearted apology that felt more like a demand for absolution. I read it once, then folded it and put it away. It changed nothing. About 2 months later, Richard drove me back to the house. It was a crisp autumn day, the leaves on the old oak tree a brilliant riot of red and gold. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw them, Lucas and Chloe. They were standing on the lawn, looking lost. They looked thinner, worn down. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by worn jeans and tired jackets. They must have been waiting, hoping. When I got out of the car, Lucas took a hesitant step forward. "Dad," he said, his voice raw. We have nowhere else to go. We've lost everything." His eyes pleaded with me, searching for a flicker of the old, indulgent father he had so expertly manipulated for years. Chloe stood behind him, silent, her face pale and strained. They looked like refugees, shipwrecked on the shores of their own greed. I walked past them, my keys in my hand. I walked up the familiar stone path to my front door. The key, a new one Richard had given me, slid into the lock. It felt strange, foreign. As I turned it, I heard Chloe begin to sob behind me, a desperate, gasping sound. I pushed the door open and stepped into the quiet hall. The house smelled of dust and silence. It was waiting. I turned back to face them one last time, my son and his wife, standing on the grass that I had mowed for 50 years. "The door is locked for a reason, Lucas," I said, my voice steady. "You sold this house, you sold me. The transaction is complete." And then, from my pocket, I pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a note I had written that morning. I set it down carefully on the doorstep. They watched, confused. On it, I had written just one address, the address for Golden Vistas Senior Living. "I hear they have vacancies," I said. Then I stepped inside, closed my heavy oak door, and turned the deadbolt. The click echoed through the empty house. A moment later, I heard a shriek of pure, unadulterated rage from the other side of the door, followed by desperate, frantic screaming. But the walls of my house were thick. They were built to last. Moral: a home is built with love and trust, not with wood and nails. When you try to sell the foundation of your family, you will find yourself homeless, no matter how much money you make. Call to action. They say forgiveness is a virtue, but is there a line that should never be crossed? Tell me in the comments. Would you have ever let them back in?